Battlefield Bad Company 2 has earned a cherished place in the memories of many people. First and foremost, for an FPS game, it had solid shooting mechanics. These were enhanced by additional elements such as bullet drop at long ranges and characteristically different ballistics and behavior for each weapon and gadget. Gadgets and tools included because things like the repair tool and defibrillators could be used to great effect and fun. BC2 was not the very first to implement these shooting mechanics in a video game, but it was among the first to practically implement them on a widespread scale. There were also elements that had been improved upon from earlier Battlefield games. It was undoubtedly a leading pioneer in implementing destructible environments on a large scale in multiplayer games. It vastly improved on the detail and scope of environmental destruction from Bad Company 1. This fact alone led to the game standing out during its prime and aging rather well even after it surpassed its 10th release date anniversary. The way smoke, fire, and dust particles lingered after explosions and breaking objects enhanced the visuals, which were good for their time, but not the greatest in terms of raw visual fidelity, such as games like Crysis and the later entries in the Battlefield franchise. Like any other game, the visuals began to look dated after a few years, however, the unique style held up exceptionally well. The art style perfectly straddled the boundary between photorealism and a stylized game aesthetic. Indeed, the game was popular for the very reason it incorporated fun game elements that could even be called arcade-like, but maintained a relatable feeling of realism that worked well to keep the game grounded, but not too slow-paced like more tactical simulator games. Animations were also generally well done, and each player remembers some memorable animations such as weapon reloading and vehicle movement. While on the topics of graphics, the character, weapon, and vehicle models portrayed their real-life counterparts fairly accurately, while still leaving room for unique touches that allowed them to not seem generic, like so many other games in the genre during that time and since then. When it comes to sound design, even recently released games have a difficult time competing. This all goes back to an intentional design choice made by the developers when Bad Company 1 was being produced. They made the decision, like with the graphics, to combine the desirable elements of realism and more stylized and even cartoon-like game elements. Certain tweaks were made to real-life sounds to emphasize and exaggerate certain aspects while toning down others. The end result gave us a lively experience. When firing guns like the M95, MG3, and shotguns, there was considerable force in the sounds. This also carried over to lower caliber weapons such as the assault rifles and pistols as well. Even suppressed submachine guns for the engineer class had satisfying tones. Reload sounds were also well liked, and it was not uncommon to see players firing a few shots and reloading again and again just to watch and listen to the reloads. The raw audio quality, even when not on the war tape setting, was exceptional. The atmosphere of each round was full and lively thanks also to the hum of ground vehicles and the buzz of helicopters. Then of course there are the memorable creaking sounds of collapsing buildings, the reverberation of explosions close and distant, and shattering glass debris. While the maps and player counts weren't as large as other Battlefield games, maps didn't frequently become too cramped. In fact, this was a welcome change in that there weren't vast empty spaces, but more moderately sized maps that felt more lively and had no wasted or dead space where little to no action took place. This, along with the destruction, graphical style, and map layouts, led to players remembering the maps for years. Speaking of the maps, the additional maps were free with most versions of the game, and if they had to be bought, they were cheap. The Vietnam expansion was also reasonably priced and carried over all the good elements of the base game. This was very important to the general positive reception and memory of BC2. It did not financially couch players for additional content, and provided desired content such as the Vietnam theme, which was heavily requested at the time. There was also community involvement in that the maps Harvest Day and Oasis were chosen and carried over from Bad Company 1. These practices were in stark contrast to the growing trend of frequently inflated prices for downloadable content and expansions that would later become commonplace for the entire video game industry, including later Battlefield games. In addition, the game and its downloadable content was practically finished when released, with few bugs that were quickly patched for the most part. This would also be in stark contrast to the growing trend of games and downloadable content being released that weren't even half complete and full of bugs that took months or even years to patch, if they were even patched at all. The community of players was fairly decent, with fewer toxic players compared to other games of the era. Though it was not uncommon for uncooperative teammates, the overall player base aged fairly well, similar to other online games that surpassed a decade of play. Most people remember the multiplayer, but the Bad Company franchise did achieve its goal of a fun, over-the-top single-player campaign. Even though it was not a serious or original story, the characters were well written and performed. When it comes to the multiplayer, even though there's no story behind the characters that represent each class, the voice acting of the multiplayer characters conveyed a similar style as the single player. Whether it was the Assault, Engineer, Medic, or Recon class on the American or Russian team, each had their own unique features that were well portrayed by the voice actors. This was quite unique for the time, and even now, because it was not common for military-themed shooters to have strong voice acting portray lively personalities. Such associations were more common for highly stylized and cartoon-like games, such as Team Fortress 2. For many players, it can be said the sound of Bad Company 2 is just as, if not more memorable than the graphics. These features also carried over to the Vietnam expansion surprisingly well, all of which just added to the atmosphere when combined with the dozens of Vietnam-era tracks in the expansion. Although it is impossible to make a multiplayer shooter 100% balanced, a lot of fans liked the class setups, particularly the Assault class carrying ammo and assault rifles, and the Medic class carrying light machine guns. Many felt this was a good improvement to the changes made in Bad Company 1, which were mostly different to classic Battlefield games from 1942 to 2142. It was also a welcome limitation that players could only crouch and not go fully prone. Otherwise, the Recon class could be even more powerful and a nuisance if teammates decided to camp with long-range snipers. Intentionally less powerful explosives, especially with the grenade launchers and helicopter rockets, was also a welcome limitation because it prevented excessive explosive spamming seen in earlier games. Explosive spamming was still prevalent, but far less of an annoyance due to the lowered splash damage. The game was not perfect. Many can remember problematic balancing with the USAS 12 shotgun, and the movement, while not terrible, was somewhat clunky even for its time. However, many players will remember all the unique characteristics that made Battlefield Bad Company 2 a special game. Lots of people were introduced to the Battlefield franchise through this game, and made many friendships with teammates that lasted for years. Although it is still possible to play the game on PC and consoles, the game has definitely seen better days, and just like any other aging multiplayer game, it's not as lively as it used to be. However, it's still worth playing and holds up remarkably well even after all this time. So if you're willing to wait through some choppy connection issues and fewer servers, it might be time to return for a few more matches. Regardless of whether you'll play again or not, BC2 will live on as an enjoyable experience for those who played it. Thanks for watching, and remember to share your memories of Battlefield Bad Company 2, and share the video with friends and your old squad mates.